بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سمو الشيخ حامد بن زايد آل نهيان، عضو المجلس التنفيذي لإمارة أبو ظبي، سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. اسمي محمد يوسف الشرهان، نائب مدير مؤسسة القمة العالمية للحكومات، ويشرفني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار في هذا المجلس الكريم لتبادل الآراء من أجل خلق مستقبل أفضل ومستدام للأجيال القادمة بإذن الله. نستضيف في هذا الحوار البروفيسورة ماريانا مازوكاتو، الأستاذة في اقتصاديات الابتكار والقيمة العامة في يونيفرسيتي كوليج لندن، حيث تشغل منصب المدير المؤسس لمعهد UCL للابتكار والأغراض العامة. حازت البروفيسورة مازوكاتو على عدد من الجوائز الدولية، وتم تصنيفها من أهم 3 مفكرين في مجال الابتكار من قبل The New Republic. كما صنفتها فاست كومباني ضمن قائمة أكثر 50 شخصاً إبداعاً في مجال الأعمال لعام 2020. هي مؤلفة ل3 كتب ساهمت في تغيير عدد كبير من المفاهيم الاقتصادية، وهي دولة ريادة الأعمال، الذي يبحث في الدور الحاسم الذي تلعبه الدولة في دفع عجلة النمو، وكتاب قيمة كل شيء، ومؤخراً كتاب ميشن إيكونومي الذي صدر حديثاً ويعد دليلاً رائداً لتغيير الرأسمالية. تقدم الدكتورة ماريانا اليوم محاضرة بعنوان نهج عالمي طموح لتوجيه الاقتصاد العالمي. تستعرض خلالها رؤيتها وأفكارها في هذا المجال، إضافة إلى مناقشة التحديات العالمية الرئيسية التي تؤثر في العالم، وفي مقدمتها المناخ والصحة وتكاليف المعيشة، وكذلك التحديات الجيوسياسية. ولماذا فشلت بعض السياسات الحالية في إعطاء الحكومات دورا استباقيا لمواجهة هذه التحديات، ومدى فعالية هذا النهج في معالجة عدد من التحديات التي قد تواجهها دولة الإمارات. نلفت عنايتكم إلى أن المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات لمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. واسمحوا لي الآن بأن أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here today and to moderate this session with one of the most prominent economists of our time, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, the director of the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London and the winner of multiple international prizes. Today's lecture is titled Directing Economic Growth, a Moonshot Approach. The moonshot approach refers to designing a goal-oriented economic system, which, if done well, it should lead to spillovers that last decades. Professor Mazzucato will share her vision and thoughts in this field, and will discuss the major global challenges affecting the world: climate, health, cost of living, and geopolitical challenges. She will also discuss the reasons why the current policy framework has failed to give governments a proactive framing to tackle these challenges, and the usefulness of the moonshot approach for addressing UAE-specific challenges. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mazzucato to begin this lecture.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Your Highness, for being here. Thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a massive honor for me. And what I hope to do is to inspire. I think that unless we actually really rethink so many of the principles and the roots of our problems, then it really truly will just continue to be, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, blah, blah. We talk about climate, we talk about future pandemics, we talk about the challenges of digitalization, but then we don't actually invest and innovate together, driving collective intelligence to actually tackle our most difficult goals. And I guess the reason I want to inspire is I am deeply optimistic. One might argue I'm naive, but the examples that I want to be talking about today show that we can, when we care, when we put urgency in the system, and when we treat our societal challenges as urgently and as ambitiously as when we go to war, where we never just put in money and hope for the best, but we structure economic systems to be outcomes-oriented when we worry about security, why don't we do it with our deep-rooted societal challenges, which we talk about, but then we don't walk the talk? Here we go. And the reason I've called it directing economic growth is something that everyone knows, but sometimes economists forget to talk about, is that the economy has not only a rate of growth, but a direction, right? We didn't have any lack of growth before the financial crisis. We had a very problematic type of growth, what I've talked about in some of my books as a financialized form of growth, where we actually failed to direct global finance to the real economy. We had massive share buybacks, for example, globally. Something like $6 trillion in the last 10 years have been used just to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay of some of the largest companies. And yet that produced a particular type of growth. We've also had growth that has led to climate change. We have had growth that has led to inequality. So talking about directed economic growth assumes that we also have a discussion within our societies of where do we want to go? What kind of economy do we want? If we're interested in inclusive growth and sustainable growth, what does that mean for the type of government activity that we have? What does it mean for the type of corporate governance? So how we set up the private sector. And especially, and this is what I really want to focus on, what does it mean for the ecosystem, for the ways that all the different value-creating actors in the system, in the public space, the private space, the increasingly relevant, in many parts of the world, third sector, how they work together. Often policymakers use the word ecosystem, but an ecosystem is not necessarily good. If you speak to a biologist, they will ask you, what kind of ecosystem? Predator-prey, parasitic, symbiotic, mutualistic? So if we want collective intelligence and to work together towards the common good and tackle these really difficult challenges that we have, we need symbiosis, we need dynamism, we need proper public, private, and third sector partnerships. And I'm hoping that my lecture today will give some insights on what that might look like, also really from some of the hardest things that we were able to do in the past. And the COVID moment, which is not gone, because the scientists tell us more pandemics are on their way. As the permafrost melts, viruses, unfortunately, will be coming our way again. We found ourselves globally so badly prepared. Now, different places in the world did different things, and I don't want to generalize, but let's be a bit generalistic here for a moment since I don't have so much time. Consider the massive failures that we had on pretty simple things. So delivering personal protection equipment to frontline health workers was not impossible. We failed to do that. So many of the deaths globally actually happened amongst the heroes who were in the hospitals trying to defend us all. But their infrastructures, the health infrastructures, the soft and hard infrastructure had not been invested in. Had the virus begun in Africa and not in China, where the health system is much weaker, we would globally have been worse off. And yet so little of the recovery funds since COVID began have gone to strengthening global health systems. We also failed to do test and trace. If governments don't invest inside their own capacity to govern digital platforms, so the infodemic side of the crisis, we're not going to be prepared for the next pandemic. Do we see, global governments investing within the civil service to understand how to use data, big data, digital platforms, so that the next test and trace system is better, more innovative? No. Did we invest globally in reducing the digital divide, so the next lockdown, the children around the world will continue to have access to their human right to education, which many stopped having when they were locked in their homes with weak internet, depending what social and class background they were from? No. Now, nothing is inevitable. The point is not no, 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 because things are so hard. we chose not to. We chose not to. And I want to really keep coming back to that, because with the climate crisis as well, globally, we are not only choosing not to, in many parts of the world, work as quickly as we should, right? Because there's a time dimension. We don't have decades and decades to philosophize what should we do. There's urgent action that's needed. But even again with the COVID-19 bailouts, the so-called recovery funds, if you look at them, and I have been looking at them globally, we actually use them to continue to subsidize many companies globally that still rely on fossil fuels. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't help companies during difficult periods, but actually these are good moments, for example, and I'll come back to it later, to put conditionality, right? Of course we'll help you. Of course you need a cash flow now because the airplanes aren't flying or our supply chains are stuck. But there could be conditions attached. And in fact, the Minister of Finance in France, Bruno Le Maire, did put conditions attached to the help that was provided to Air France and to Renault. The companies had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in order to receive that recovery fund that they needed, again, because the planes weren't flying. But to do this, to confront these challenges, the future pandemics, the challenges of digitalization, the challenges of climate change, and everything that climate means, which is changing how we move, what we eat, the materials we use to build, it requires a proactive design of policy. And I've been writing now for many years. My father always says, don't people get tired of listening to the same thing? I say, no, it's always different audiences. But I've been saying for many years, we have to rethink the design of policy. What is the state for? If it's only, at worst, get out of the way, the Reagan kind of Thatcherite view, but at best, and it's the at best I'm talking about, at best putting patches in the system, bandages in the system, fixing what economists, and I'm an economist, call market failures, then we will be designed to fail. We are designed to be reactive. We are designed to worry. So it's a negative. Worry about the market failure, and then we act. Or maybe we wait for the market to fail, and then we act. So it's a negative. Even the concept of the public good is a negative. It's filling the gap. It's filling the gap of something the private sector doesn't do. This is very different from a more proactive stance, framing, economic theory, which is what I've been trying to advocate for, about co-creation, co-shaping the market, co-shaping the economy. If the economy is an outcome, there's nothing deterministic, it's an outcome of how we design government structures, how we design private institutions, how we design their interrelationship driven by a common good goal, then we have to sort of abandon this bandaging up, right? And I do believe that the word common good is much stronger than the public good. The common good is an objective. It's an objective we go after together that requires collective intelligence and a lot of collective investment in innovation and interactions. The public good, until now, in economics, is about filling the gap of something someone else has not done. And I mentioned the financialized economy. There's a lot of discussion around the world amongst the large global corporates in places like Davos at the World Economic Forum that we need change within the private institutions. That this overly financialized, just maximization of shareholder value model of corporate governance needs to change. And the concept that is often put on the table is of the purposeful company, or if we want to sound fancy, stakeholder value. And I really want that perhaps one of the most important takeaways today is to walk the talk of stakeholder value instead of just blah, blah, blah. We need to learn to create value together differently. It can't just be about redistributing the value afterwards to the poor, to the school systems, and so on. What does it mean to collectively create value in a pre-distributive way, ex ante, and how we innovate together, how we structure intellectual property rights, how we structure a collaboration to create a vaccine where the vaccine ultimately also gets distributed to everyone in the world instead of allowing rent-seeking along the way. So to design a stakeholder value notion of the economy and to really have collective intelligence and the common good at the center of the system, I do think we need not only a different model, different theory, but we also need to unpick the examples, the few times we really delivered on doing something really hard. And delivering personal protection equipment to frontline health workers was not that hard, and we failed to do it. So, the moon landing. It was exceptional. And by the way, the United Arab Emirates are actually leading in many ways around the future of space. So I'm very excited when I come here to speak to all the different people who've been involved both in the HOPE Mars mission, but also that are really thinking about the role of technology and the changing government structures in order to, again, think about the future of space, but also the Earth shots here. But the moon landing, for me, was so interesting from the beginning, even just from a vocabulary, a kind of narrative, a storytelling side. If you think of Kennedy's famous speech, he said something so deep that many people know, but for me as an economist, I say, wow, that is very different from how we talk within the economy. He said, we're going to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. For those of you who are as nerdy as I am and actually read all those white papers around the world, the policy documents, you'll know that that's not how we write about policy. It's the opposite. We talk about facilitating. I'm Italian, facile. Facilitating, facile means easy. So one party making something easier for someone else, right? The government's going to facilitate innovation in tech and nanotech and internet and biotech and space. That's not the story that got us to the moon. We're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. And yes, because it's hard, we're probably gonna make mistakes along the way, and that's okay, right? So venture capitalists in the world often brag about the risks they took, the mistakes they might have made along the way to a great success, and that's part of their narrative. When civil servants and when public servants make mistakes, do we celebrate them and say, great, hopefully you'll do trial and error and error and error and then learn to do things better? No, we punish them. In the United Kingdom, we put them on the front page of the Daily Mail and say, never again. Government, again, get out of the way. You don't know what you're doing. So this embracing of uncertainty, of experimentation, of admitting it will be hard. And also, you know, he also said, it is going to cost a lot of money, but it's going to be worth it. So the idea that actually a goal-oriented system, talking about the goals and then backtracking and thinking what it means for the budget, thinking what it means for the tools, procurement policy, thinking what it means for the design of the collaboration. All these things are incredibly important. And one of the first things that they did within NASA, the US Space Agency, was to realize their own organization was not fit for purpose. After the Apollo 1 fire, when those 3 famous astronauts died, one of the astronauts, Gus Grissom, on the day of his death, when the lunar simulation model blew up, said, how are we going to get to the moon if we don't even know how to talk between 2 or 3 buildings within NASA? So think of all the critiques that we hear about governments working within their departmental silos, the lack of an all-of-government approach. They realized that they had to change because they had a purpose, a very difficult, hard purpose of getting to the moon and back in a short amount of time. That required a different type of organization. This fancy chart here was taken from George Mueller's redesign of NASA on the back of that fatal day. He came from Bell Labs, you might know, was a very important organization which came out of AT&T, but it was really a public-private innovation laboratory, which was at the root of the IT revolution in the US. This guy came into NASA and said, okay, we need to reorganize our system in order to really be aligned around a common objective, but also to create a lot of communication, agility, flexibility, communication between these buildings that were not talking to each other. So the notion of an all-of-government approach, which, by the way, again, I think the UAE in many ways leads on, in the sense that you have that discussion. At least the last 5 years when I've come and spoken to different excellencies within the government, they're thinking about this, right? Some governments think about it, not many kind of change what they're doing, but this idea of an all-of-government approach is especially needed if you actually care about the direction where you're going. And what was interesting was that the challenge was beat the Russians, the space race. The mission was getting to the moon and back in a short amount of time. To do so, they required hundreds of thousands of people in many different sectors to collaborate. There was 400,000 people involved in the Apollo project. There was many different sectors. It was not just aerospace. It was nutrition, materials, electronics, software. The whole software industry, as we know it today, was in some ways a spillover of the moon landing. And all the homework problems that had to be solved along the way actually got us a huge amount of economic value on Earth, right? These commercialization opportunities around camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, scratch-resistant lenses, a baby formula. These were solutions to problems. This is already a really important point, because today we tend to obsess about technology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, space technology. And yet all the technologies, including the ones in my iPhone today, that make it smart and not stupid phone, that's why we call them smartphones, are technologies like the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, which actually came out of public money. But what's more interesting, it was public money which was problem-oriented. No one said, we need the internet, it's the future, digital 4.0 or whatever. Why do we have the internet? Because the US government wanted the satellites to communicate. The internet was the answer. Why do we have GPS? The Navy wanted to know where those ships were across the oceans, a solution to a problem. So a directed economy, when it's smart and fueled by innovation, is a problem-solving economy. So the discussions we should be having are, what are the key problems, the missions we want to solve, and design the system so it fosters as many solutions bottom-up to solve the hundreds, if not thousands, of homework problems along the way. And again, what was interesting in NASA was, to do this, they said, okay, we're not fit for purpose, not only in terms of the organizational design, which I already mentioned, but also the tools. So public sector procurement, right, which is a tool that every government has to purchase stuff. So it's not only a supply-side investment push, it's also a demand-side purchasing. And often these contracts are just kind of static. They create an inertial relationship between government and its suppliers. And they realized that the type of procurement they had, which was cost plus, was not leading to the innovation they needed. And so they changed it. It was a political economy question, not just technological, to fixed price, like a challenge-oriented procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So all those spillovers along the way didn't just come about because they said we need spillovers. They came about through a redesign of a tool, of an instrument like procurement. And by the way, in the UK, where I live, the whole innovation budget is £10 billion. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport is $40 billion. Okay, so go across the board, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Education, using public sector procurement as an innovation, outcomes-oriented tool. So green procurement, even for hospitals and schools, can be a key driver of innovation and quality improvement. And NASA knew that. It helped us get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. Another cool thing they had, and this is very relevant today, given the discussion about cost of living, was no excess profits. Not no profits. No profits would mean we're going to get to the moon through philanthropy or charity. No, it was, government investment, public sector investment, interesting deals, but no excess profits. What does excess mean? Does it just mean too much? Excess. In excess of what you did, right? So when we have collective intelligence, whether it's making vaccines, whether it's investing in digital platforms, whether it's the future of our energy transitions, which require renewables, how do we actually structure the deal? think of the word Green Deal, the deal, so we share not only the risks, but also the rewards. So burden sharing, right? Sharing both the risks and the rewards. And the way NASA thought about that, because they were not there to make a profit, was to say, industry, we need you, help us, but you're not going to turn this into a gambling machine, okay? And I would actually argue, if you look at the problems we have in today's healthcare market, it's sort of turned into a gambling machine. Look at the profits that Pfizer is making today on the back of a massive collective effort. And so really, the key point of my recent book called Mission Economy was to say, so, we talk about other types of problems. This isn't just technological, military, industrial complex space race from the 1960s. No, what we care about today, and this is so relevant to the UAE's hosting of COP28 next year, which I'm so excited about. We're talking about climate, we're talking about health, we're talking about gender, we're talking about inequality, we're talking about future mobility systems that we need. Why don't we treat these problems as seriously, as concretely, as common good innovation challenges as we did when we went to the moon? And I repeat, I think my answer is perhaps we just don't care enough. And so what I did in recent years is I worked closely with different governments, especially in the European Commission, where I was the special advisor of the head of the innovation program, and I said, look, let's just backtrack a bit in everything I just said. Imagine if we begin with the Sustainable Development Goals, and every country will interpret them as they wish. You know, it needs to be locally, a local context. Turn them into missions, moonshots, which are truly ambitious, inspirational, but especially cross-sectoral, to get away from that idea that, you know, different industries can lobby their way up and tell government to treat them more specially. So intersectoral collaboration to solve a problem. And that's because we need the collaboration around all sorts of new ways of what we eat, how we move, how we build that I mentioned, but also that issue of redesigning the tools to fuel that bottom-up experimentation. And the two examples I gave in a report I wrote for them, which is free on the web if you're interested, the mission-oriented approach to innovation in the European Union, was to say, look, take, for example, SDG 14 around life below water, clean oceans. Turn it into a clear, directed target, goal, right? So reduction of 90% of plastic entering the marine environment and collection of more than half of plastics in our oceans, seas, and coastal areas by a certain date, 2025, whatever that date may be. And all the different sectors that would be required for that. This is just a sample. Chemicals, marine, AI, design, waste, biotech, but especially then to foster that bottom-up experimentation, trial and error across all those different sectors. And similarly, of course, climate, whether it's carbon neutral cities or any kind of place-based thinking in terms of carbon neutrality, of course it's not just renewable energy. It's so many different ways in which we live, produce, distribute, and consume. And what is a mission? You know, because sometimes these words can get captured and they can mean anything to, and we just use the word to mean what we were already doing before. They really have to be bold and inspirational. And this is why actually having serious stakeholder engagement within our societies, both between different ministries, but also different actors in the economy, to perhaps also co-create and decide together what those missions are. Clear direction. And can you say yes or no, did you achieve it? Forget the conspiracy theorists who say we never got to the moon. But anyway, they could actually say, did you get to the moon and back in a short amount of time? Ambitious while realistic, so really pushing the frontier of our existing capacity, but also, you know, helping create that transformation, especially through that kind of conditionality that I talked about. The need to be cross-sectoral and cross-disciplinary. Too often we think this is just about the STEM subjects, right? Physics and engineering. We need the humanities as well to help us dream of a better future. I remember the last time I was in Dubai, I went to the Museum of the Future. Or in Brazil, they have the Museum of Tomorrow, which helps us reimagine where we want to go. And of course, poets and you know, the humanities have always been, or the cultural industry has helped us reimagine the future. So this truly should be also interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral, and the ability of using those tools on the ground to really foster that bottom-up experimentation. You know, how to do this is much harder said than done, so I've also worked a lot with policymakers on the how. What does it mean for that agility and flexibility in the system? What does it mean for the impact-driven targets and the portfolio setting, so we don't put all our eggs in one basket? These are all different, you know, questions that, of course, are incredibly important. But perhaps one of the most important things is really the design of the policy itself. So in the UK, for example, the industrial strategy of the past was literally just a list of sectors: aerospace, automobiles, life sciences, finance, and the creative sector. And I said to them, why? Why just those 5? There's many other sectors. Why not actually be bold on the challenges? And they chose these 4. I worked closely with Greg Clark, who at the time was the Minister of Business, Environment, and Industrial Strategy. And think of these 4 challenges which they chose, like future of mobility, and think of all those different sectors that might be required, including, say, if part of the mobility strategy is to have a public transport system that is 100% not only sustainable, not only congestion-free, but also accessible. That would mean that some of those bottom-up projects come from the world of disabilities, for example. So a true driver of innovation. And really what this is all about, then, the mission-oriented approach, is not saying don't invest in basic science and, you know, the kind of old framing for innovation. Of course, that's the horizontals. It's the verticals that need to change. The how, of course, we need a strong innovation system. We need research and development spending. We need institutions that create a linkage between science and industry. But the verticals of the past, which chose technologies, sectors, or types of firms, in many parts of the world they talk about small, medium enterprises as very important. I think that's the wrong lens. Worry about the challenges, the missions, and get as many different sectors and types of firms to collaborate with you. So it's more of a picking the willing than picking the winners. And if the company is small, it will need extra help because it's small. But you don't help it just because of its size, right? So this mission-oriented approach also means really aligning our instruments to be goal-aligned. And it's not going to happen without investing within the public sector itself. This is why I'm a big fan of Gov Labs. I was just in Chile a couple weeks ago to talk to the new government there about their missions. And they have something that's really useful. It's called Laboratorio de Gobierno, a government laboratory. And in some ways, I would argue that the Prime Minister's office here has for a long time thought about this, that experimentation and the Gov Lab kind of a philosophy of needing to try things out. However, creating safe places for government to be a bit crazy, to test out different forms of procurement, different forms of budgeting, different forms of collaboration, I think is very useful because it allows you to fail and to learn along the way. And the challenges in any part of the world, I just put up some here that I've heard about in speaking to different stakeholders in the region over the last years, whether it's departmental silos. I'm from Italy. We are very siloed in our government. The need to improve productivity, the need to think of the post-oil economy, accelerating diversification, boosting the private sector, but also having the right relationship with the private sector, talent attraction. These are all incredibly important. But the irony is, my experience, and I'll say this humbly, is when we worry about the economic outcome, it doesn't happen. Think of all those spillovers that happen along the way, the investment, the innovation that was required to solve the problem. That's a key driver of productivity. Whereas when we just say, we need a lot of talent to come to our country, we need to increase productivity, we want more jobs, we want more, make it easier for the private sector to come with visas. That's the end result. Why would someone want to come? Because you are the coolest place in the world to do X, Y, or Z, which is an outcome of the way that you frame what the country is about, where it wants to go, and how serious it will be to actually tackle those really difficult problems. And the need for that all-of-government approach, I've already talked about that breaking down of those governmental silos. How important is that? And again, I am extremely excited to see how things move over the next year, but also afterwards with any nation that hosts COP28, 29, COP30. I was just in Egypt for COP27. And that need to link the way that you're framing your own challenges, right? New ways to think about nutrition, new ways to think about materials, renewable energy, of course, itself, and your own advances around solar. But really also thinking about it, again, with this idea of collective intelligence and the common good at the center, an opportunity in some ways to redesign the social contract, which is about how all the different parties work together. A patent is a contract. It's when the government gives the private sector 17 years of monopoly profits. What does that mean? What do we get back? What does the government get back? How do we design a patent system so it really fosters more innovation in the future and not have patents that are too wide or too strong, hard to license, and too upstream, which is what's happened in the patenting world globally. So these are about the contracts, the relationships, the ecosystem that I talked about before. I've already mentioned all these things, but just to remind ourselves, we need new capabilities. We need to redesign the tools. The institutions we have, like a sovereign wealth fund or a public bank, they need to be redesigned. In Germany, the public bank, called the KfW, its loans to the steel sector, and remember steel and cement are some of the biggest polluters, because they have a vision and a mission around the Energiewende, that loan that the KfW provided to the steel sector has been conditional on steel lowering its material content, its carbon footprint. So today, Germany and Sweden have the greenest steel sector in the world because they had to in order to get that public loan. But that feels like a stick, right? It feels like no, this is kind of a win-win strategy, because then by having the greenest steel sector, that sector is now ahead of the game. It's good for its competitiveness. So by social contract, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Let me just skip ahead because I'm out of time. Just maybe two more examples. This all sounds very techy, right? Whether it's the moon or steel or solar panels. What I've been inspired by in some parts of the world is when they normalize it. Just make it like the everyday way we just do normal stuff, right? So in Sweden, they have this ambition for a fossil-free welfare state, and they land it on things like school lunch, right? The lunch we provide in the public school system. And I know that your own president, Your Highness, is putting just so much emphasis, actually, on education, and education for all. And what does that mean for everything we supply through our education system, not just the books, the lunch? And in Sweden, school lunch has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. And that means it requires a change in the supply chain. It means that kids in the schools can get involved in designing lunch. It means that the curriculum, biology, mathematics, English, poetry, can also use some of that co-creation around something as specific as lunch. But that just means that the everyday procurement for something as simple as lunch, not just the high-tech stuff, needs to be bold and outcomes-oriented. And again, food, transport, how we move, how we build, what we eat. These are all opportunities for a moonshot and mission-oriented approach, but only if we care, only if we make the choice to do that. And lastly, I'll just say, one of the biggest failures of COVID-19, which I began with, was precisely on this. The mission was not the vaccine. The mission was vaccinating the world. And Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, who I work with very closely because I chair the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, calls it vaccine apartheid, when 80% of the vaccines are hoarded by 10% of the countries. Why was that? It's because of how we produced those vaccines. It was how that collaboration between public and private went wrong. It didn't have that common good at the center. And by the way, AstraZeneca, which worked very closely with Oxford University researchers, they actually together formed what I would call a more mutualistic partnership. The costs remain low, the prices remain low, and AstraZeneca agreed to share the knowledge. It was a condition posed by the publicly funded researchers at Oxford. So we can do things differently, but to do them differently, we need to remember Keynes's John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economists ever, quotes, he said, practitioners on the ground who think they're just kind of doing stuff and getting the job done are often slaves of defunct economic theory. So I really encourage us all to kind of rethink the economics of all this in order to get better practice. And for me, this has been about rethinking value as collectively created, markets not just being fixed, but actively co-shaped, investing within our capabilities of government and not outsourcing it to the McKinseys of the world, a big problem which I'm writing about in my new book, outcomes-oriented budgeting. Finance is not neutral. How we structure finance matters. Tackling inequality from a pre-distributive way, getting those conditions right between all the different actors. Partnering in this symbiotic, purposeful, stakeholder-driven way. What does that look like? What are the metrics we need to know if we're doing that? And then this issue of participation, the example I gave of the school children. Get the kids involved. And wouldn't it be amazing if COP28 was done through the lens of school children, right? Given that they're the next generation. And COP29 and COP30, the next generation. How do they view the world? How can we really gather that participation so it's not just Fridays for the future, kids striking on Fridays, but actually being part of this mission setting. So thank you so much. I'm sorry if I went a bit over. And thank you again, Your Highness, for inviting me, and I hope to be of any help to the region for this moonshot thinking. Thank you.
Professor, thank you for the insightful presentation and thoughts. I'd like to ask a few questions, if you don't mind. You spoke about value creation. It's always assumed that it occurs only in business with some support from the public sector. But you have always argued that it is collectively created. So how can it also be collectively shared when it comes to the value itself?
Sure. So, you know, I always begin with this idea of who do we allow to call themselves value creators? Do school teachers say, I'm a value creator? No. It's often in places like Silicon Valley, we hear about value creation and wealth creation. So really reminding ourselves that value requires lots of different actors, but that also the framing of where we use that word matters, right? And so how we actually value in terms of investments and resourcing those organizations like the school systems, the hospital systems, and so on, are all part of this kind of widening up of how we talk about value. But the sharing of the rewards from that require, I really believe, new types of contracts. Now, this is either through the kind of conditionality that I mentioned, making sure that at the design of the contracts, we have the idea of a deal. So what does it mean for the structure of the intellectual property rights, which I mentioned? Think of the prices of the drugs, of the medicines that are fueled by public and private sector investment. Why don't the prices of the medicines reflect that collective contribution? So that would be putting access through the prices themselves. There's no real market, you know, in the medicine industry. In the US, for example, $42 billion a year is spent by the government on medicine innovation, and yet the prices don't reflect that. And what's even more interesting, in the law in the United States, the government is allowed to cap the prices of drugs. It's called march-in rights for those drugs that it invests in, but they've never exercised that right. It's almost a crisis of confidence. I often say I go in as an economist and I come out as a life coach. But other ways to do it would be through equity stakes. Think of Tesla and Solyndra. They both got from the US government, and sorry if I keep giving examples of the US, but why? Because people say the US is market-led. They say Silicon Valley was private sector-led, but there was huge amounts of public investment, which we didn't talk about, so we didn't structure it into the deals. Tesla and Solyndra both got a guaranteed loan from the Department of Energy for $500 million. Solyndra went bust. It was a famous solar company. Everyone knows that story, so it was used to bash government. They don't know what they're doing. They're picking winners. Get out of the way. Tesla, of course, we all know about Tesla. It was a success. How did the US government fail? It didn't talk about it. The American citizens don't realize that Tesla itself got a government loan. And second, they structured the loan in reverse. They said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we want 3 million shares in your company. Why would you want 3 million shares in a company that doesn't pay back a loan? It's probably not a very good company. Had they done the 3 million shares when the loan was paid back, sorry, I feel Bad you don't see me there. So the loan was paid back in 2013. It was taken out in 2009. The price per share between 2009 and 2013 went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. So that requires like a public venture capital view of the problem. And these are just some examples, but the only reason we have these examples, or I talk about them, is because we begin with the idea of sharing risks, collective value creation, so sharing rewards. If we don't have a story to tell of how the risks were shared, we don't even get to the point of finding creative different solutions to share the rewards.
Thank you, Professor. Another question is based on where you ended your presentation with the scenario of COVID-19. So the race to find a vaccine, is a good example of a moonshot approach or a moonshot mission, whether it achieved the target or not. So what could be another or the next global moonshot mission globally?
So again, the COVID mission should have been vaccinating the entire world. It wasn't the vaccine. We have 8 different vaccines. Great. We could have 20, but if we don't vaccinate the world, we haven't mission accomplished. I do think the climate-related missions are the most important. And I personally have learned a lot by working with mayors around the world, because cities are smaller, or it could also be a region which is smaller, because that ability to bring together different actors in the system to co-create the mission is really important. So in Camden, which is the part of London where I live, I co-chair the Camden Renewal Commission, where we try to bring this moonshot approach to the city. And Camden is a microcosm of the world. We have the best. We have the British Library, the British Museum, my university, University College London, Wellcome Trust, Crick, all lying side by side with extreme inequality. So Somerstown, a neighborhood in Camden, has extreme forms of poverty. It's afflicted by knife crime amongst teenagers, right? So what is a way to think about a clean growth mission for Camden, which brings citizens, people who live in Camden, to the table to talk about it, so it's not just top down, the elite telling people to retrofit their homes, yeah? So one of the things we did is we thought about the clean growth mission in some of the most poor parts of Camden, in the housing estates, social housing, and we brought the resident associations and the citizen assemblies to the table to debate what's clean growth for you, what is sustainability, what does it mean for your neighborhood? And another thing was to give agency, so power. So during COVID, because of the inequality that rose, we have food banks. Food banks in London, one of the richest parts of the world, we have people starving, literally, like not being able to feed their children. So food banks, people come in really distraught. I've seen the mothers with their children. It's embarrassing when you have to go to a food bank. So one of the things we did was to say, transform these food banks into food cooperatives, right? A cooperative means that the people benefiting from the food are actually making the decisions. So we make it a green food cooperative, so it's part of the clean growth mission. But the most important thing was participation, and make it an honor, nurture people's souls along the way, right? Because of course there's a lot of pushback around the world on the elites, in Davos or in the university room or in any sort of setting or great conferences we have, making all the decisions. That creates populism, that creates distrust. There's so much distrust out there. So this idea of really, in whatever way, in every country it's different. We all have our local contexts, but engaging the people in the communities to be part of this mission setting, I think that's really important. So the answer is a bit roundabout, but definitely climate related, but with participation at the center.
What about the UAE? So what opportunities are there for the UAE?
I mean, the last thing you want is a foreigner coming and telling you what to do. So maybe I can just say what has inspired me, because I've been coming to the UAE now for quite some years. And one of the reasons I found it so interesting has been precisely this open discussion about the need to do government differently. I mean, you guys have this thing called Service One, which is so cool, right? It's like a one-stop shop for the welfare state. Like almost like in a mall, you can go in there and get your driver's license, your passport, all sorts of different things, which in the normal world, you need to go here and then there, and some people even give up along the way. The famous filmmaker Ken Loach, if you've seen his films, It's, these people who have to fill out all these different forms, and really it destroys their soul along the way. So making the welfare state easy to access, a user-friendly welfare state. And again, the word welfare state perhaps is not how you frame it, but the access that citizens have to the benefits that a government produces, I actually think you're very advanced on that. And I think bringing this idea of government experimentation with new tools to the what are we doing, the climate challenges, the health challenges, the digital challenges. You also have been really ahead of the game on the space mission, your Hope Mars mission, which I find very inspirational, but also if you look at the different ways that you are investing in renewable energy and solar, I think that idea that I came up with at the end with the Swedish example of just normalizing this stuff. What would it literally mean for a conversation here, for changing how we move, how we eat, how we do procurement across all those different government departments, but how they think about it together, because climate has to lie above the ministries. I always say everyone should get rid of any department of climate. It should be, literally within the presidency's cabinet office kind of stuff, right? And then what does it mean for the Department of Energy? What does it mean for the Department